It was a warning that shook the very foundations of North American defense, delivered by Canada's top spy in a way no one saw coming. The Arctic, long considered a frozen and distant backwater, is suddenly the center of a geopolitical earthquake. Countries from around the world, including China, have set their sights on the North, seeking strategic and economic advantage. And Canada, the quiet, polite neighbor we've always assumed would follow America's lead, just changed the rules entirely. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about Western alliances, defense, and American dominance. NATO leaders were left speechless. Pentagon generals were in disbelief. And President Trump, despite years of aggressive rhetoric, just lost control of the Arctic. For decades, we've been told a story that when America leads, the world follows, that allies are reliable, that Canada, our neighbor to the north, answers when Washington calls. Maybe late, maybe a little reluctantly, but they answer. That story is dead. In January 2026, Canada made a military decision so bold that it sent shockwaves from Washington to Brussels. This was more than budgets, more than equipment. It was a fundamental shift in the balance of power. And it all came at a moment when Trump's own threats to annex Canada, to turn it into America's 51st state, spectacularly backfired. This is the Canadian Arctic, a place few Americans think about, yet one that has suddenly become a focal point of global strategy. Canada's military, stretched thin and under-equipped for decades, has quietly transformed itself. The mission? To take control of the Arctic and protect it, not under NATO, not under American command, but under Canada's own national authority. At a NATO working group meeting in Brussels, something unprecedented happened. The American delegation, as usual, presented language that would have placed Canada's Arctic defense assets under NATO command, effectively under U.S. command in a crisis. Standard procedure for 70 years. Then came the silence. A Canadian civil servant, senior but not a politician, stood and said simply, "Canada cannot agree to that language. The assets in question will remain under national command." The room froze. The American admiral blinked, assuming a translation error, but the Canadian repeated it. National command, no automatic delegation. That pause, that quiet moment, was the sound of the post-World War II order hitting a wall. This is how systemic shifts happen. Not with explosions or headlines, but with calm, firm decisions that rewrite decades of precedent. Canada has just built an independent Arctic defense network. Sovereign command, national control, no dual keys, no joint authority. Every sensor, every drone, every satellite belongs first to Ottawa. They've partnered with European firms rather than American defense contractors, building domestic technology and infrastructure that the U.S. can't access without Canada's permission. This isn't just a fence. They've hired their own security, installed their own eyes in the sky, and told Washington they have no jurisdiction on their land. For Pentagon planners, it's a nightmare. For decades, U.S. military strategy assumed total situational awareness in the Arctic. Every Russian submarine, every missile test, every shift in the ice could be tracked, shared instantly, and countered. Now Canada is controlling the data flow. The Americans must ask permission to see what's happening over their own northern frontier. Trump's threats, his brash comments about making Canada the 51st state, only accelerated this transformation. Instead of intimidating Ottawa, they convinced Canada it could no longer depend on Washington. Political chaos in the U.S., trade wars against allies, erratic foreign policy, all of it pushed Canada toward independence. They calculated the risk of relying on America was greater than the risk of standing alone. And the Arctic is not just about pride or politics. It's resources, routes, and raw power. As the ice melts, new shipping lanes open, worth trillions. Untapped oil, natural gas, and rare earth minerals become accessible. Russia has been militarizing its Arctic coast for a decade. China, thousands of miles away, is calling itself a near-Arctic state, investing in icebreakers and research stations. Meanwhile, the U.S. assumed that Ottawa was a reliable staging ground for American interests. That assumption is now gone. Canada is asserting a principle that has been tested for decades: sovereignty over its territory, the right to control who passes through its waters. The Northwest Passage, once a matter of gentlemen's agreements, now requires hard power to enforce. Handshakes are no longer sufficient. Military capability, surveillance networks, drones, satellites, and independent command are now the new currency of control. This is more than just hardware. It is a psychological blow. The United States has long operated on the assumption that allies follow American leadership without question. That assumption is dead. For Canada, independence in the Arctic is insurance against unpredictability. It is the realization that subordination carries more risk than autonomy. The consequences ripple far beyond Ottawa. NATO faces questions it has never confronted. If Canada can retain full command over its Arctic assets, why couldn't Norway or Turkey demand the same? The alliance, long presented as a unified front, now faces the potential of fragmentation. Russia and China are watching carefully, noting cracks in the Western alliance, seeing a precedent for asserting their own independence from traditional power structures. Meanwhile, the Pentagon struggles to adjust. American intelligence has long depended on automatic sharing through the Five Eyes alliance. Canada now introduces data sovereignty. Surveillance data goes first to Ottawa, which then decides what, when, and how to share with Washington. Suddenly, one of the world's deepest intelligence networks has a valve inserted. Information no longer flows freely. For U.S. strategists, it is like going blind in one eye at the height of the Cold War. The ripple effects extend into the defense industry. Major U.S. contractors, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, had long counted on Canada as a reliable customer. Lobbyists, consultants, sponsorships, decades of expectation, all rendered moot. Canada is no longer buying American systems that feed into U.S. infrastructure. They are creating independent supply chains and technology ecosystems. This isn't just a lost contract, it's a lost influence. The quiet neighbor just stepped out from under America's shadow. This is a reversal decades in the making. The DEW line, built in the 1950s across the Canadian Arctic, was an enormous infringement on sovereignty, run largely by the U.S., with American flags flying on Canadian soil. At the time, the existential Soviet threat justified it. Canada traded sovereignty for security. But today, they've seen the risks of relying on an unpredictable America and chosen autonomy. The implications are vast. The U.S. may respond with economic pressure. NATO faces an internal challenge. Russia and China are watching and waiting. The upcoming NATO summit will be dominated by the Arctic issue. For the first time, the United States might not get its way in its own hemisphere. For decades, the Monroe Doctrine framed the Americas as America's sphere of influence. Canada just rejected it, not with rhetoric, but with billions in sovereign military capability. They've proven that respect cannot be assumed. It must be earned. Trump wanted Canada as the 51st state. Instead, he created an independent global military power. The quiet neighbor just demanded equality, and the superpower that took loyalty for granted is learning a lesson in humility. The Arctic itself is changing fast. Ice is melting, shipping lanes are opening, and resources are becoming accessible. Canada has responded with rapid procurement of surveillance satellites, a fleet of long-range armed drones, and a revamped Navy and Coast Guard capable of Arctic operations. Training exercises will expand from 6 months to nearly 10 months a year. Allies are invited, but Canada retains the primary command. The U.S. is now dependent on Canadian permission to access data and maintain awareness of its own northern frontier. This is not partnership. It is dependency. It challenges the very notion of American unilateral control. For the Five Eyes alliance, it disrupts decades of seamless intelligence sharing. For the Pentagon, it creates strategic blind spots. For defense contractors, it destroys an assumed pipeline of influence. The Arctic is no longer a frozen periphery. It is the stage for a new kind of sovereignty. A battlefield where strategic independence trumps reliance on allies. Canada has changed the calculus for the United States, NATO, and the world. What once worked for 70 years no longer applies. The Arctic is warming, geopolitics are shifting, and control over the top of the world is up for grabs. This is more than a story about Canada or America. It's a story about what happens when a small but capable nation realizes it no longer needs to follow. It's about how decades of assumptions can crumble overnight when strategy meets courage, foresight, and autonomy. The quiet neighbor is no longer quiet. The reliable partner is now an independent power. And the world is watching to see how the superpower will respond to a lesson it never expected to learn.